Now, back live with Chris Kenny.
Many of you would have caught up with the story that's been unfolding in recent weeks about Professor Peter Ridd, who's a scientist with the James Cook University up there in Queensland, who's taken a counter view to many of his colleagues when it comes to the climate change and the impact on the Great Barrier Reef. For his trouble, he's been kicked out of his job. He's been dismissed from the university, and there is a battle royal about to occur in the courts as a result of all that. He joins me via Skype from Townsville now. Thanks for joining us, Peter.
Like so many Australians, Dr. Peter Ridd loves the Great Barrier Reef. A marine geophysicist, Peter has been studying the reef for over 35 years, until recently as Professor of Physics at James Cook University. But Peter disputes the view that the reef is dying because of climate change. Speaking out against this climate change hysteria made Peter Ridd a target of his former employer, James Cook University. And after years of warnings, censures and absurd gag orders, Peter was finally terminated in May 2018. Now Peter's fighting back in what could become the most significant case about academic freedom and free speech in Australian legal history. So you were subjected to years worth of censures, of warnings, of gag orders under the pretense of confidentiality directions.
Well, a couple of years of some fairly horrible times of essentially being chased, having your emails read, extremely officious meetings. The administrations wouldn't talk to me. It was all done through lawyers. Stuff to my wife wasn't allowed. It was like being hunted, actually. And you'd get these brown paper envelopes and your heart would race and I'd literally be sweating profusely until you'd read through yet another batch of allegations made against you. It was just a horrible time, absolutely horrible time. I'm a physicist. I did a physics degree at James Cook University starting in 1978, and I went teaching for a couple of years, and but also started a PhD even when I was teaching, and then I joined the Australian Institute of Marine Science, and that's when I started to learn about oceanography.
So Peter, how long have you been studying the Great Barrier Reef for?
Since 1984.
Right.
So we worked on all sorts of things, mostly the currents and the movement of sediment. The movement of the water is the big thing though. How the sediment gets moved around, how waves resuspend material off the bottom. Done a lot of work on temperatures.
So I guess, is the Great Barrier Reef dying?
No, look, the reef is in fantastic shape. I often say that of all the ecosystems in the world, possibly with the exception of Antarctica, the Great Barrier Reef is one of the best preserved there is.
So Peter, what would you say to the naysayers and the usual suspects who would paint you as somebody who doesn't care about the environment?
Well, you know, I come from an environmentalist family. Right from a very early age, you know, I've been in environmental organisations. I used to be the president of the local branch of the Wildlife Preservation Society. I'm an environmentalist.
What was your career like at JCU in whole?
It was great. I was a very successful academic. I was a good lecturer. I was often put on the big first year classes to teach physics to people who didn't want to teach physics, and I really enjoyed it. And I had, you know, 30 fantastic PhD students over the years. It was a really good time, and I greatly miss it.
What have we got here on the wall, Peter?
Well, that was the inaugural JCU Supervisor of the Year for PhD supervision.
Right.
So I supervised about 30 PhD students, and I was supposedly a good one. And that's my 25-year service at JCU.
Yeah.
Altogether, I worked there for 30 years, and I was associated with 40 years because I was an undergraduate student and a
Wow.
PhD student there as well, and also a postdoctoral fellow.
So for 40 years you're at JCU?
Yeah,
Wow.
that's right.
Yet despite his ample qualifications, Peter has found himself going against the so-called conventional wisdom when it comes to the reef. In particular, Peter has taken issue with the quality of the science.
The basic problem is that we can no longer trust the scientific organisations like the Australian Institute of Marine Science, even things like the ARC Centre of Excellence for Coral Reef Studies. A lot of this stuff is coming out, the science is coming out not properly checked, tested or replicated. And this is a great shame, because we really need to be able to trust our scientific institutions. And the fact is, I do not think we can anymore. I think that most of the scientists who are pushing out this stuff, they genuinely believe that there are problems with the reef. I just don't think they're very objective about the science they do. I think they're emotionally attached to their subject.
But isn't
and
science,
you can't blame them. The reef is a beautiful thing.
Isn't a scientist supposed to have always a degree of scepticism? So he's checking and checking and rechecking rather than presenting stuff as empirical proof.
It is these consequences that have made Peter increasingly determined to speak out.
As I approached retirement, I thought, people's livelihoods are actually being badly affected in the sugar industry, in the mining industry, you name it, in North Queensland. This is a big issue for North Queensland. And if somebody doesn't say this, well, the rubbish is just going to go on and on and on. So there was an obligation, a duty to just keep on going.
So you've been vocal on these issues, including in our publication, Climate Change, The Facts. When did you start running into trouble with your employer?
Well, that happened when I pointed out that there were some photographs of a reef, one in 1895 and one more recently, one showing it in beautiful and then another one recently showing it dead, and I pointed out that this was wrong, and I was asking the question, what quality assurance was done on that science to make sure it was right, because this was being used in public policy. And my employer didn't like the idea of me essentially criticising those scientists for not having proper quality assurance processes. This was in about 2015, so I ended up being censured for that, which was a pretty horrible process, and that was the first of the major problems that I had with JCU. After we did this chapter in Climate Change, The Facts, I made a comment that I thought that two organisations were untrustworthy because they did not have anything like a decent form of quality assurance of their science. And then things got worse when we tried to defend ourselves, and the university then read all my emails to look for examples where I had just mentioned the fact to other people. So they were saying, we're accusing you of serious misconduct and you're not allowed to tell anybody about it.
No.
And because I'd mentioned it to other people, including my wife, I got another 25 counts of serious misconduct.
These allegations were made by James Cook University despite the fact that Peter was not in breach of his employment contract. In fact, the Enterprise Bargaining Agreement covering staff at JCU has extensive protections for academic freedom.
If you can get a person where you can monitor all their communications, you can isolate them, you can then crush them psychologically. It's the old trick of any totalitarian regime. That's what they do, and this is unfortunately what's happened to universities now. They've become very authoritarian organisations that are run by the administrators rather than by academics.
But this is a place of higher learning. This is a place of supposedly open intellectual inquiry.
And that's the problem. If this was a company, well, they sort of own you, right? But this is a university, and if these sorts
public
of...
institution.
A public institution, public money is being used here, and to use that to do these sorts of things is a disgrace to what a university should actually be.
Would it be fair to say that in the 21st century at our universities, the old ethic of the search for the truth at the very least has been diluted?
I think that's definitely true, yeah. I mean, it's in the funding as well, that you've just got to go along with whatever's the flavour of the month. And
what in particular attracts the most funding? I can hazard a guess, but...
Yeah, well, you've got to say climate change at least half a dozen times in any application to have any chance at all.
Under this academic climate, your career might not have been possible. The heights you reached as a professor, you would have struggled.
Yeah, I think I would have struggled, and I worry about the young ones nowadays, I really do. They are constrained in all sorts of ways, what they can say, the way the education, the way they lecture, but then they look at the research, they look at what happened to me and think, I'm not going to go near the cliff edge that he went, I'm not going to say anything controversial. And that's absolutely what we shouldn't be encouraging our young academics to think.
But rather than give in to the university, Peter decided to fight. Using crowdfunding website GoFundMe, Peter raised over $250,000. The fundraising campaign took just 5 days. I mean, I guess what's different in your case, Peter, is that you've had some substantial support from fellow travellers.
Yes, and the IPA has been the first of those, and I'm incredibly grateful for them. Not just for the financial support, because they gave me a little financial support for the original legal things, but it was also the moral support which helped me go on. I was literally packing up my office when I got the second set of allegations, and then John Roscombe gave me a call and said, well, he's going to get some lawyers to look at it, and it wasn't until that happened that we were actually in with a fight. There's a duty here, in fact. There's just some absolute rubbish being spoken about the reef, and people's livelihoods are actually being put in jeopardy by this thing. And if nobody will stand up, then this is just going to go on and on and on. It has to be stopped.
Now Peter's case is before the Federal Circuit Court, with the hearing set down for the end of March. JCU would have you believe that this is just a narrow legal dispute, but this case is about so much more than that. It's about what academic freedom means. It is about what free intellectual inquiry means. And above all, it is about the rolling crisis at our university campuses and across the nation. The crisis of freedom of speech.